Pushing forward, the protagonist finally moved down the hallway, forcing each step to seem natural. The officer stayed close, matching the pace. As they neared the body, two men were already at work, examining the scene. One was a familiar lieutenant, the other a medical examiner. The weight of the moment settled in, and the reality of the situation became undeniable. The investigators studied the scene with cold detachment, examining every clue without emotion. A man had been shot at close range, leaving behind black stains on his face and a small splatter of blood on the wall. The professionals didn't care about his past or the good deeds he had done in life. They only focused on the mystery of his death. But for the protagonist, things were different. Regret crept in as they stared at the lifeless body, recalling moments they had been envious of him. One of the investigators stretched, groaning about the lack of exercise, while another teased him about life at home. Their casual conversation was quickly interrupted as they turned their attention back to the crime scene. The protagonist recognized the victim, a graduate student studying literature. This raised suspicions. Why did so many of the murder victims seem to have some connection to them? It was a question left unanswered. The protagonist had been called there by someone desperate for help, someone named Ivy. Before answering more questions, they insisted on seeing her first. The investigator was skeptical but allowed it, making it clear he would be listening in. Stepping into the apartment, the protagonist immediately noticed something crucial. The shooter had been inside. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting the victim had let the killer in willingly. The investigator's sarcastic remark about the obvious observation didn't go unnoticed, but the protagonist ignored it, focusing instead on the details. Inside, Ivy was a wreck, barely holding herself together. Tears stained her cheeks, and her voice was hoarse from crying. She clung to the protagonist, whispering her fears. Should she call a lawyer? What should she do? The protagonist quietly advised her. If she was innocent, she should tell the truth. If she was guilty, she shouldn't say anything at all. Then came something unexpected. Ivy mentioned gold that had been stolen decades ago. She believed that was the reason behind the murder. The investigator caught on immediately, demanding to know more. But the protagonist shut it down. Now wasn't the time. Ivy, however, was certain. She wiped her eyes, her voice steadying. She was ready to tell everything. Tension filled the room as the discussion unfolded. The protagonist listened as the conversation took a serious turn. A man confirmed that the gold from 75 years ago was real and still in the city. That revelation connected directly to a recent tragedy, confirming suspicions that someone had been killed over it. A woman was adamant that the stolen treasure had led to the murder, her voice firm as she explained the connection. She was asked to sit, and as she settled into the chair, another man crouched beside her, his eyes sharp with urgency. He wanted every detail, starting from what had happened earlier that night. She hesitated but agreed, knowing that this information was crucial. The group leaned in as she began recounting her evening. She had gone to dinner with someone before heading to a movie at a nearby shopping mall. The details were clear. She even pulled out ticket stubs from her purse, proving her story. After the movie, they returned to their apartment, parking outside before walking down the hall. As they approached the door, the man she was with reached for his keys, but before he could unlock it, the door suddenly burst open. Inside, a figure dressed in black stood waiting. The masked man held a gun, pointing it directly at them. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. The shot was precise, sending the victim crashing against the wall before collapsing lifelessly. The woman was frozen in place, her body paralyzed with fear. The shooter, showing no rush, stepped past her and walked away, his movements slow and unsteady, as if he were weak or injured. She had immediately called for help, dialing emergency services before reaching out to the protagonist. The investigation pressed on. A woman asked for a description of the shooter. The witness hesitated, glancing at the protagonist. The size was similar, but the attacker had been thinner. That small detail gave some relief. However, with the ski mask covering most of his face, she had no clear recollection of his features. The questioning continued, details about his eyes, his skin, and even whether she was sure it was a man. She was certain, though she struggled to explain why. Meanwhile, investigators reported their findings. No neighbors had heard the shot, likely due to the weapon used. The security system in the building lacked cameras, leaving no visual evidence. The shooter had likely used a revolver, as there was no shell casing found at the scene. Then came another pressing question: had anything been taken? Walking through the apartment again, the woman confirmed that nothing valuable seemed to be missing. The electronics were untouched. But then she hesitated. Something was off. The research papers, the notes belonging to the victim, had disappeared. Whatever information they contained had been important enough to kill for. The room was in complete disarray, with papers scattered everywhere. The woman was certain that someone had gone through the notes, searching for something valuable. She believed the intruder had been in the apartment when they arrived, panicked, and fled. However, another man pointed out that the slow exit didn't indicate panic. The conversation shifted to the importance of the notes. They weren't just any notes, they contained information about hidden gold. The mention of treasure instantly changed the mood in the room. Some were skeptical, while others demanded an explanation. The protagonist revealed everything, from the first letter received to the phone call just an hour ago. Shocked, one man struggled to believe that someone had been murdered over buried treasure. The idea seemed absurd, but those present knew that people had killed for far less. The protagonist provided details about two suspicious men and their vehicles but admitted not seeing them clearly. However, what stood out was the mention of a young woman with an unusual name. This woman had a history with the victim and had once been obsessed with him. She had harassed him through phone calls and even left disturbing notes. Though she had disappeared in recent weeks, her involvement in the gold's discovery made things more complicated. The woman in the room was visibly upset, refusing to believe that the victim could have betrayed anyone. However, the protagonist had a different view, convinced that the victim had manipulated everyone around him for his own benefit. The police officer in charge remained skeptical of everyone, including the protagonist. He bluntly asked if the protagonist was searching for the gold as well, treating them as a potential suspect. Despite a long history between them, trust seemed fragile in the face of treasure and murder. The protagonist was left stunned by the accusation, realizing just how deep suspicion ran. The man sat there, studying him intently. He recounted his movements from the time he left the Minnesota Historical Society, explaining how he managed to lose the car tailing him. But the officer wasn't interested in that. Instead, he focused on the part where he picked up the woman and their journey afterward. The man assured them that she could confirm his story, but the officer scoffed at the idea of trusting someone who would date him. He ordered another officer to check the restaurant where the man claimed to have eaten, ensuring there was a receipt to verify his story. The man couldn't believe his alibi was being questioned so thoroughly, but the officer reminded him that he would have done the same in his position. The conversation was interrupted by another officer, who informed them that reporters were gathering outside. The officer in charge made it clear, no one was to speak to the media. If news spread about buried treasure being a motive, chaos would follow. He glared at the man as if warning him personally. The discussion shifted when they were informed that the body was being moved. The man followed the officer to the doorway, watching as the coroner's team lifted the corpse and secured it in a black bag. A plastic evidence bag was handed over, containing only a wallet, some loose change, and a pen, nothing that gave away any clues. As they wheeled the body away, the man expressed his frustration. The officer, despite his strict demeanor, patted his shoulder in a small gesture of support. Later that morning, the man was woken by knocking at his door, but he was too groggy to react. His phone rang, but he ignored it, assuming it wasn't urgent. When it rang again minutes later, he finally got up, still unwilling to answer. Instead, he peered outside and spotted a news van parked near his house. A reporter stood beside it, pressing a phone to her ear. Moments later, his phone stopped ringing, confirming his suspicions. Checking his voicemail, he found a message from the reporter, eager to interview him about lost gold and its connection to the recent murder. He immediately realized the officer would be furious. As he got ready for the day, the phone kept ringing. The reporter wasn't going away. He wondered who had leaked the information. Could have been any of the officers, but he knew he would be blamed regardless. If that was the case, he might as well take control of the situation. He called the reporter back, careful to use his cell phone to avoid revealing his location. When she answered, her voice was calm and professional. He introduced himself and acknowledged her request for an interview. The protagonist was still at the police department when a call came through. The person on the other end knew a lieutenant there and agreed to meet in 15 minutes. After ending the call, the protagonist watched as someone drove away in a van, making a passing comment about them not being very sharp. At home, the protagonist went about a daily routine, toasting a bagel using an expensive toaster, enjoying the convenience of modern gadgets. But before the bagel could be enjoyed, a knock at the door interrupted. Expecting someone else, the protagonist was surprised to find a familiar woman standing there, clearly upset. Her greeting was far from friendly, accusing the protagonist of reporting her to the police. Unbothered, the protagonist admitted to it without hesitation. What followed was a brief but sharp exchange of insults, almost like a game, before she stepped inside. Without warning, the protagonist shoved her against the wall, pinning her down while searching her for weapons. She protested, but the search continued, leaving no room for trust. Once satisfied, the protagonist let go, tossing her bag back. She fumbled but caught it. The tension lingered in the air as she questioned the search, but the protagonist dismissed it as a precaution. She insisted she had no involvement in what happened to a certain person, but the protagonist remained skeptical. Despite the tension, an unexpected calm settled as the protagonist offered breakfast. She hesitated at the mention of a snow cone but eventually accepted a bagel with strawberry cream cheese. The protagonist prepared it while making coffee using a high-end machine, leading to a lighthearted conversation about expensive kitchen gadgets. She pointed out the contradiction of a well-stocked kitchen in an otherwise empty home. The protagonist admitted to battling consumerism but joked about losing the fight. As they ate, the woman looked exhausted. Her hair was messy, her dress wrinkled, and her eyes tired. She explained she had been interrogated by the police for 6 hours after being dragged out of bed at midnight. The protagonist noted her worn-out state but, instead of sympathy, offered a teasing remark about her still looking good. Their playful back and forth continued, exchanging words with growing familiarity. Eventually, the real question came, why was she there? She insisted she had nothing to do with what happened to Josh. The protagonist responded with a simple, okay, but whether it was belief or indifference remained unclear. The tension was thick as the conversation unfolded. The woman insisted that the police believed her, but skepticism lingered. Fear crept into her voice as she expressed her worries. Whoever had killed the other man might come for her next. She was convinced the murder was connected to the gold, and if the killers knew about it, they likely knew about her as well. The seriousness of the situation wasn't lost on the man she spoke to, though he questioned her level of fear. Desperate, she pleaded for help, but the man remained skeptical. She mentioned others who might assist, but they had been detained by the police. That left him as her only option. She wanted protection, not just for herself but for both of them while they searched for the gold. In her eyes, they had no choice but to partner up, especially now that another key player was gone. However, he wasn't ready to commit without knowing the terms. When she offered an even split, he finally agreed, urging her to start talking. But she hesitated. Her answers were vague, and when pressed about the killer, potential suspects, or anyone else hunting for the gold, she had nothing concrete to offer. Frustrated, he grabbed the remains of her bagel, tossed it aside, and escorted her to the front door. If she wouldn't share valuable information, he wasn't going to waste his time. She protested, saying she couldn't go home because someone might be waiting for her. But when asked who, she refused to say. With no patience for secrets, he shut the door on her, suggesting she find a motel. As he cleaned up, his phone rang, bringing a new problem. A familiar voice informed him that a man had been waiting outside a local spot, asking about him. The caller, wary of danger, had denied knowing him, sensing that being associated with him wasn't always safe. The man in question had been polite but persistent, and there was one concerning detail. He had a gun. Without hesitation, he ordered the caller to contact the police. She hesitated, confused about his urgency, but he made it clear she needed to do it now. Within 10 minutes, he arrived at the scene, expecting trouble. But instead of a shootout or confrontation, he found a calm discussion between two uniformed officers and the man in question. The stranger was young, well-dressed, and looked effortlessly fit. He seemed apologetic, explaining that he had a legal right to carry a concealed weapon but was willing to lock it in his trunk. His demeanor was polite, but the situation remained unclear. Why was he looking for him? And what did he really want? Outside the club, officers wrapped up their questioning, satisfied that no harm had been done. The man, standing with a confident smile, introduced himself and claimed he had been searching for the protagonist. His charm was evident, but the protagonist wasn't easily swayed, especially given the earlier incident involving a gun. The man quickly dismissed it as a misunderstanding, assuring that his weapon was locked away. A woman nearby confirmed that she had called the authorities after feeling uneasy about him earlier. The man apologized, his words smooth and practiced, making her blush slightly. As the officers left, the three stood in the parking lot, and she offered coffee inside, mentioning that the place wasn't open yet but had a fresh pot brewing. The man accepted with exaggerated gratitude, kissing her hand in a way that made her blush even more. The protagonist watched, unimpressed by the act. Inside, the woman poured coffee and apologized for its quality, but the man dramatically called it nectar, charming her further. However, he soon shifted focus, stating that she was a delightful distraction but that he and the protagonist had important business. She took the hint, retreating toward the bar, though not before stumbling into a table in her flustered state. The protagonist watched, exasperated by her reaction to the man's presence. The man then inquired about her relationship status, making the protagonist sigh in frustration. Ignoring the comment, the protagonist pressed him for the real reason he had been looking for him. The man, ever theatrical, admitted he was an English major and mentioned his academic background. Their conversation shifted to two individuals, one of whom had met a tragic end. When the protagonist mentioned this, the man responded with a literary reference, quoting a famous author's phrase about death. The protagonist, unimpressed, abruptly asked where he had been the previous night. For a brief moment, the man's smile faded before he regained his composure. He deflected, but the protagonist kept pushing, asking about the weapon he carried. Hesitant at first, the man finally admitted he had a .32 revolver. The protagonist pointed out that the murder had been committed with a similar weapon, making the man's smile vanish completely. Sensing the tension, the man quickly changed tactics, suggesting that the protagonist was trying to provoke him. The protagonist remained silent, watching as the man's expression shifted. Then, with a calculated tone, the man revealed his true intent. He wanted to buy the letters. The conversation unfolded with the protagonist cautiously navigating a tense negotiation over some valuable letters. The other man, confident and persuasive, made an offer, proposing a generous share of the proceeds. The protagonist, however, remained guarded, revealing little about his intentions. He mentioned a competing offer from another person, which the man quickly dismissed, warning of the risks involved in dealing with them. Despite the assurances, the protagonist refused to commit, keeping his options open. The discussion shifted to a woman connected to the protagonist. The man questioned what she could truly offer besides the obvious, which irritated the protagonist. He disliked how people kept belittling his acquaintances. The man then matched the competing offer but insisted that any separate agreements the protagonist had must be settled from his own share. Seeing no immediate downside, the protagonist agreed, leading them to focus on the letters. The man pressed further, wanting to know if the protagonist actually possessed the letters. The protagonist remained evasive, only stating he could obtain them when the time was right. The other man, skeptical, wanted immediate action. He also hinted at having inside knowledge, though he refused to disclose his sources. When asked if the letters could lead to a hidden treasure, the man seemed momentarily caught off guard. He carefully studied his coffee mug before finally responding with a question of his own. Who had written the letters? The protagonist deflected, prompting the man to reach his own conclusion. The protagonist had never actually read them. This realization shifted the tone entirely. The man, now doubtful of the protagonist's usefulness, decided to end the conversation. He assumed too much, believing the protagonist already had access to the letters. Now convinced otherwise, he withdrew his interest, leaving a business card before swiftly exiting. The protagonist watched him go, uncertain whether he was frustrated or embarrassed. Shortly after, a woman at the bar made an offhand comment about the man's appearance, playfully speculating about his personal life. The protagonist humored her, but the conversation quickly turned to whether she should show interest in the man. Her indecisiveness amused him, leading to a light-hearted exchange before she walked away. Shifting focus, the protagonist pulled out his phone and made a call. On the other end was a police lieutenant, who immediately voiced his frustration. A persistent reporter had been bothering him, convinced that the protagonist was being held as a material witness in a homicide case. The officer blamed the protagonist for the situation, sarcastically thanking him for the trouble. The conversation started with the protagonist joking, but the man he was speaking to didn't find it funny. When asked if his alibi had been confirmed, the man replied that it had, though many were disappointed by the news. The protagonist teased that he could leave town now, but the man warned that there were plenty of bitter people who might not be pleased about that. Then, the protagonist shifted the conversation, questioning what else the man had talked about with a particular woman. He made playful remarks about how she addressed him informally, but the man brushed it off, emphasizing that having media contacts could be useful. The protagonist hinted that another woman in the man's life might not be happy about that connection, but the man dismissed it quickly. Shifting gears, the protagonist offered the man another suspect, though the man initially refused, saying he had enough. Still, the protagonist insisted he would be interested and described a person named Whitlow, who was searching for letters he believed someone had and carried a weapon. The man listened but remained skeptical until the protagonist pointed out something suspicious. Whitlow had claimed not to know someone yet had described another person in detail. This made the man pause, realizing it was strange, and he admitted that he enjoyed getting these unexpected pieces of information. Later, the protagonist noticed he was being followed soon after leaving a parking lot. The tale was good, maintaining distance and alternating lanes to avoid suspicion. The protagonist wasn't sure if the pursuer was connected to Whitlow or someone else, but noted their skill in disguising their presence. However, the protagonist was already on high alert and recognized the tail's movements. Rather than reacting immediately, he acted normal, waiting for the right moment. As he approached an intersection, he used a traffic maneuver to lose the tail, taking a series of quick turns that forced the follower into a disadvantageous position. In the end, he successfully evaded them. Eventually, the protagonist arrived at an apartment, where a woman answered the door, looking exhausted and distressed. She had clearly been expecting someone else, likely the police, and seemed worn out by the ordeal. She clung to the protagonist, though it felt less like affection and more like she was seeking stability. Her face was swollen, her eyes were red, and she hadn't changed clothes. She admitted that the police had been questioning her extensively, asking about her relationship with someone, potential arguments, and even life insurance. They had searched her entire place, collecting fingerprints, and she knew they were looking for a weapon. She asked the protagonist outright if they suspected her. The protagonist explained that it was standard procedure for the police to start with those closest to the victim before expanding their investigation. He reassured her that they were already questioning others, including a person named Whitlow. At the mention of Whitlow's name, she hesitated, repeating it with some uncertainty. She didn't know him but found the name unusual. This led them into a brief conversation about names, joking about how parents choose strange ones, including her own childhood nickname, which she had hated. The conversation grew tense as the woman revealed a surprising encounter. A man had approached her with an offer, half of a hidden treasure in exchange for certain letters he believed she possessed. He was certain that these letters would lead to the gold, yet his shock was evident when she admitted she didn't have them. Confusion clouded her mind. How had he known about her connection to another man? And why did he believe she had those letters? The very mention of them was new to her. The protagonist tried to piece things together. Had the missing man ever spoken about letters? The woman shook her head, but she explained that he had been searching through private collections, family heirlooms filled with old documents, diaries, and photographs. Maybe he had found something important, but if he had, she was sure he would have shared it with her. He always told her what mattered. Pressing further, the protagonist asked if she knew who the man had met the day before he vanished. She hesitated before admitting she didn't. Then came the difficult question. Could he have been working with someone else? Perhaps a close friend or even a secret lover. The idea angered her. She insisted she would have known if there was another woman. There had been no secrets between them, or so she believed. Her frustration deepened when she felt like she was being interrogated, just like the police had done. She had already told them everything, how she and the man had trusted each other completely. He had once described their bond as something ancient, like they had known each other for centuries. The discussion shifted to the gold. The police had asked about it, and so had the media. A pushy reporter had even tried to get an interview, pressing her for answers. She had refused, shutting the door in the reporter's face. The protagonist approved of her decision. If the news spread, treasure hunters would flood the area, making it nearly impossible to find both the gold and the person responsible for the man's death. Silence settled between them as she gazed out onto her balcony, lost in thought. When she finally turned back, tears threatened to fall from her eyes. She asked if they should continue searching for the treasure. The protagonist agreed it wasn't just about the gold anymore. It was about making sure the killer didn't get their hands on it. Besides, it would give her something to focus on other than her grief. With a deep breath, she made her choice. She extended her hand, sealing a deal 50-50. The protagonist accepted. Her grip was firm, her resolve clear. Then she led the way to a room filled with documents. Stacks of old newspapers, notes, and records covered the desk. If there were any clues about the missing letters or the hidden gold, they would be buried somewhere in that room. The search for answers took an unexpected turn when the woman revealed a crucial detail the police had overlooked: a logbook containing records of past events. The last entry documented everything from the previous day, including a meeting and an incident at a local establishment. However, the page that should have contained notes for the next day had been torn out, raising suspicions. The woman immediately linked it to the person responsible for the recent crime, and the protagonist agreed. They debated whether to inform the authorities immediately but decided to dig deeper first. Determined to uncover more, the protagonist sifted through piles of research. Most of it seemed to be a historical record, fascinating yet not directly helpful. Frustration grew as nothing pointed to the hidden gold they were seeking. The woman offered coffee and food, but the protagonist declined, lost in thought. Doubts crept in about the credibility of previous information and whether the real mastermind behind the search had been someone else. There was also the troubling possibility that the person who had committed the crime had already taken anything useful, meaning they knew exactly what to look for. Eventually, a newspaper excerpt caught the protagonist's attention. It was a society column about a woman leaving for Europe just after a major historical event. The protagonist recognized the name and its connection to a past crime and noticed that the researcher had underlined it twice, emphasizing its importance. The timing seemed suspicious. The protagonist quickly instructed the woman to call an officer and report the missing page from the logbook, but decided to keep the newspaper excerpt a secret for now. Leaving the scene, the protagonist noticed a car parked down the street with a clear view of their house. It was likely the same vehicle that had been following them earlier. The driver ducked down to avoid being seen, but the protagonist had already spotted him. Not wanting to alert the pursuer, the protagonist acted naturally, entering the house through the front door to maintain the illusion of ignorance. Once inside, a pair of binoculars helped get a better look at the stalker, a young man with sandy blonde hair, around the same age as others involved in the case. Suspicion grew. Was he another player in this dangerous game? For now, the protagonist chose to observe rather than act. After changing into fresh clothes, the protagonist prepared to head out for a long-awaited performance at a well-known jazz club. The event was special, featuring a talented singer whose career had spanned from local cafes to prestigious stages. This was a rare chance to see her perform again, and the protagonist didn't want to miss it. However, just as they were about to leave, the phone rang. Already impatient, the protagonist answered sharply, not realizing that this call could change everything. The protagonist answered a call from a young woman whose voice carried the weight of sorrow. She hesitated, struggling to explain why she had called. She revealed that she had been asked to do so by someone named Josh Berglund. However, before she could explain further, she admitted that she had just learned of his death, something she was still trying to process. The news had come from a television report at the Community Life Center, where she had only caught a glance of the tragic announcement. Trying to comfort her, the protagonist gently asked for her name. She introduced herself as a student at Bethel University, currently unsure of her major but considering economics. She also mentioned that she had met Josh at a nursing home where she volunteered, and he had been there to interview her uncle. Over time, they had grown close, and she still couldn't believe he was gone. The protagonist pressed her about why Josh had given her his name and number. She hesitated but finally explained that Josh had called her in a rush, saying that things were moving quickly. He hadn't specified what he meant, only that if something happened to him, she should call the protagonist. Confused and shaken, she had followed his instruction but had no idea what message she was supposed to deliver. When the protagonist pushed further, she finally revealed that Josh had warned her not to let certain people get it. He had used a crude term to describe them but hadn't explained who they were or what it was. When she had asked, Josh had laughed as if it were a riddle, leaving her even more bewildered. The protagonist asked to meet her, but she refused to see anyone that night. However, she agreed to meet the next morning at 10 a.m. outside Benson Great Hall, a location easy to find near the campus gate. Since freshmen weren't allowed cars on campus, she preferred to stay within school grounds, something the protagonist completely understood given the circumstances. He assured her she could bring friends if she felt safer. Before he could get more answers, she reached her limit. Apologizing, she abruptly ended the call, too emotionally drained to continue. The phone was dead, leaving the protagonist momentarily frozen. Thoughts drifted to the nature of true art, how some paintings are just decorations, while others hold depth and meaning that captivate the soul. That's how the protagonist saw the woman by his side. He had known her for years, seen her in every emotion, from anger to joy, exhaustion to bravery. Yet sometimes, just catching her in a certain light left him breathless. That night, she had been in the kitchen, playfully dodging the busy chef, only for the chef to stop and declare, "One of us has got to go." Laughing, the woman grabbed the protagonist's arm and led him away, comparing the chef's work to a cooking show where she actually got to taste the food. He hugged her and kissed her cheek, surprising her. When she playfully questioned it, he simply said he enjoyed her company, making her dramatically fan her face in mock surprise. Dinner was served in her office, a carefully crafted meal of asparagus salad, pancetta, and butter-poached pheasant egg, followed by a rich beef tenderloin dish. As they ate, the chef entered, picking up a fencing trophy and eyeing the protagonist with challenge. It was an unspoken tradition for him to throw in a sarcastic remark about the food, leading to playful banter, but this time he couldn't. The meal was too perfect. He admitted it, catching the chef off guard. She searched his face for a sign of sarcasm but found none. With a dramatic sigh, she called him annoying and left, only to return moments later with a demand. Tomorrow's meal would be scallops, and she expected a witty remark. Then she was gone again. Later, the protagonist and the woman sat together in the lounge, holding hands as smooth jazz filled the air. It was almost a perfect evening, until he noticed someone watching them. A young man with sandy hair, dressed in khakis and a blue shirt, sat at the bar, pretending not to stare. The protagonist let out a quiet sigh, which the woman caught immediately. When he told her about the man, she, of course, turned to look despite his warning. The protagonist suspected the man was following him and suggested she check if he was paying with a credit card. But instead of playing it safe, she had a bolder idea. The woman walked over to the bar and signaled for the bartender. They exchanged a few words while he checked some receipts, and after a brief conversation, she returned to the table. She confirmed that the man in question was paying his bar tab as he went but had also ordered dinner, short rib tacos, which he charged to his credit card. His name was Alan J. Franz. When she asked if he was familiar, the response was simple. Not yet, but soon. The following morning, there was no sign of the car that had been watched the night before. At first, there was suspicion that Alan had caught on, either switching cars or even organizing a full team to track movements. To be safe, the drive to the destination took an indirect route, nearly 20 miles out of the way, to ensure no one was following. Frustration grew at Alan's absence. Was he avoiding the situation or simply oversleeping? After navigating through a few wrong turns, the meeting spot was finally reached. A young woman sat alone on a curb outside a large academic building, looking somewhat lost. She was dressed modestly, her white cardigan draped over a buttoned-up blue shirt, neatly tucked into a khaki skirt. Around her neck, a silver cross hung from a chain. There was something fresh and untainted about her, like an apple straight from the orchard. She introduced herself with a tentative handshake, seeming unused to physical contact. A small smile crossed her face when she heard about the navigational mishap, joking that most of the campus had already been explored. The university, a Christian liberal arts institution, stood apart from the rest of the city with its vast campus, natural surroundings, and carefully maintained trails. The place resembled a resort, complete with pedestrian bridges and secluded paths. When asked where they should talk, she suggested a walk. Her pace was comfortable, steady but not rushed. Unlike the woman from the bar, who always moved with purpose, this young woman walked at a natural rhythm. As they strolled past other students, it was clear that modesty in dress was a common trend. Nothing revealing, nothing tight. It sparked curiosity. Was there a dress code, or was this simply a shared belief among them? Once they were far enough from the buildings, the young woman spoke about someone from her past. She and this person used to walk together along the lake, through the trails, even off the paths into the woods, hand in hand. It was a cherished memory, filled with quiet moments and shared presence. She suddenly stopped walking. Running her hands through her hair, she seemed lost in thought. Her hair shimmered between gold and auburn, the color shifting in the light. As she reminisced, her voice softened. At first, she hadn't thought of their time together as romantic. But then, as they held hands, walked along the lake, and shared a kiss, something changed. She struggled to put it into words, her emotions evident. Her eyes welled up, lost in a memory that had clearly shaped her. For someone so reserved, so careful, it must have been a deeply significant moment. The anger burned deep, a rage so fierce that if the man responsible had still been alive, there might have been no stopping the desire for revenge. The thought of what he had done was unbearable. The woman beside him turned away, unwilling to meet his gaze. He tried to offer comfort with a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but she stepped away, her hands tugging at the hem of her white cardigan. She repeated the words as if trying to convince herself. He's gone. He's gone. Determined to keep up with her quickened pace, he asked the question that weighed on his mind. Who killed him? Why? She hesitated before responding, unsure of what she truly knew. The man reminded her that she had been told to call him, hoping she could provide some answers. Confused, she admitted, yes, but I don't know why. He pressed further, asking her to recall the exact words. She explained that she had been instructed to write down a name and a number, his. If anything happens to me, call him, she had been told. And then came the chilling warning, don't let them get it. When she asked for an explanation, there had been only laughter, a promise to call later that was never fulfilled. Curious about the connection, he questioned how long she had known the man. 12 days, she answered after a moment of thought. It felt like much longer. Their bond had been intense, almost as if they had known each other forever. It wasn't the first time she had been told something like that. She revealed that they had met at a nursing home where she volunteered, offering companionship to the forgotten souls abandoned by their families. Many of the elderly residents suffered from failing memories, lost in the cruel grip of time. The man she had known had been writing a book about the gangsters of the past, not to glorify them but to warn people about the dangers of allowing such power to rise again. He had come to the nursing home seeking information from someone who had lived through that era, an old man who, despite his years, still had stories to tell. She spoke of the elderly resident with fondness, though he wasn't truly her uncle. He was just a lively old man, confined to a wheelchair, his health unpredictable. Some days he seemed fine, while others, the weight of age and the burden of medication took their toll. Yet he never forgot her. The past came alive as she recounted the tales the old man had shared. He had known them all, the criminals who once ruled the streets, the infamous bank robbers whose names had become legend. But this man wasn't just a storyteller. He had been one of them. He had spent 25 years in prison for robbing banks, and when asked if he would change anything about his life, he had simply laughed. "I probably would, but I'd be more careful." Then came a name that made everything shift. Frank Nash. The revelation was startling. The old man had been friends with Nash, a connection that ran deeper than just stories. Together, they had stolen gold from a bank in South Dakota, a detail that had piqued the interest of the man now gone. The pieces were falling into place, and one thing was clear. Meeting this old man was no longer an option. It was a necessity. "I want to meet him," the man said, his determination unwavering. The woman nodded. "He would like that. He doesn't get many visitors. When would you like to see him?" The woman hesitated for a moment, checking the time before glancing at the chapel. She had a business class, something related to information technology, but after a brief consideration, she decided she could get a friend to take notes for her. Without much delay, they made their way to the nursing home, which was located near a strip mall. The entrance had a chapel on one side and an office on the other, resembling a deli counter. The woman confidently introduced the visitor as a friend coming to see an elderly man. Her familiarity with the place and the way she held onto the visitor's arm, as if guiding a lost child, seemed to put the staff at ease. The home was surprisingly quiet as they walked down a carpeted corridor toward an elevator. The visitor had expected something more chaotic, perhaps like a scene from an old movie, but instead, everything was calm. The woman led him to a spacious common room, leaving him there as she went to fetch the person they came to see. The room was large with thick carpeting, comfortable chairs, sofas, and shelves filled with books and games. A big screen TV hung on the wall, though no one was watching. At one table, 2 men and 3 women were engaged in a card game. As the visitor moved closer, unintentionally stepping between them and the window, one of the older men snapped at him to move out of the way. Embarrassed, he quickly apologized and stepped aside. Soon, the woman returned, pushing a wheelchair into the room. The elderly man sitting in it had a wide grin, his face full of energy despite his frail frame. He was dressed in black slacks, a black shirt, and a gold cardigan, with a stylish yellow cap perched on his head. Though he had once been tall and imposing, time had clearly taken its toll, making his clothes look oversized. As soon as he laid eyes on the visitor, he made an observation. "You're a cop." His voice carried a knowing tone, making the woman beside him react immediately, as if he had just said something improper. The visitor didn't deny it. Instead, he admitted that he had once been in law enforcement, extending a hand for a handshake. The old man's grip was weak, his skin thin like parchment, but his spirit remained strong. With a chuckle, the elderly man reminisced about his past, talking about how he had always been able to recognize law enforcement types. He spoke of his best friend, a former cop, and how they had once run a bar together, a strange partnership between a lawman and a man with a less-than-lawful past. Their place had attracted all sorts of people, officers, lawyers, even crooks. It was, as he put it, like a license to steal. His laughter shook his frail body, and the woman beside him sighed with familiar affection, calling him by a title that hinted at their close relationship. The visitor expressed regret at seeing him in a wheelchair, but the old man quickly dismissed the concern. He insisted that he could still get around well enough, sometimes walking to the nearby shopping mall just to prove a point. Still, he admitted that his legs weren't what they used to be. With a grin, he added that if given the choice, he'd rather be pushed around by someone as sweet as the woman beside him. She blushed at the remark, but there was warmth in her expression. Shifting gears, the visitor asked if he could ask some questions. The old man chuckled knowingly. "See? A cop," he said, turning to the woman with amusement. He joked about how lawmen always started with small talk before getting to the real interrogation. Then, with a teasing smirk, he asked if the visitor wanted to talk about the new days or the old days. When the visitor mentioned wanting to know about a certain figure from the past, the old man's demeanor shifted slightly. Recognizing the name, he called him by an old nickname and admitted that they used to work together. Just as he was about to share a story, he suddenly paused, looking up at the woman. He recalled that someone else had been asking about the same person just a week ago, a young man who had seemed particularly interested in her. He warned her to stay away from him, calling him a weasel. She promised she would. Mike eyed the man carefully, his words carrying a weight that couldn't be ignored. He spoke with confidence, pointing out how someone's eyes could reveal everything about them. The man next to him, a veteran of many experiences, nodded in agreement. He had seen it before. Some had the right look, the right instincts, while others, like a certain young one they had encountered, were all wrong. He made sure the woman beside him understood, reinforcing that there was no need for sympathy for that kind. She agreed without hesitation. The conversation shifted. The topic of Jelly came up, but Mike knew better. The real interest wasn't in Jelly himself, but in the last job, the South Dakota job. It was always about the gold. Everyone wanted to know if it was still out there, buried and waiting to be uncovered. The young one before had pretended to be after something else, but it was obvious what he truly sought. Now, the same question was being asked again. Was this man looking for the gold too? His answer was straightforward, yes, and he was willing to split a portion if he got help. That was enough to convince Mike. The woman beside them smiled slightly as the agreement was made. It was time to tell the story. The memory took them back to a day in 1933, near Huron, South Dakota. A map was spread out on the hood of a car, its seal marking its authenticity. Mike recalled how bold Jelly had been, strolling into the surveyor's office and asking for maps under the guise of planning something completely ordinary. He had walked the streets of the town, familiarizing himself with every detail, buying from the stores, chatting with the clerks, acting like just another friendly face. It was part of the plan, making sure he knew everything about the place before they made their move. One man tapped a crossroads on the map, stating that they might need to make a choice when they got there, north or south. Mike hesitated, confused. Why was he being asked? The response was clear. He would be the one driving, so he needed to decide. Nervously, he suggested heading straight east, but the experienced man challenged him. If law enforcement were trying to stop a group of outlaws fleeing with stolen gold, where would they set up a roadblock? Mike traced a highway and pointed to a likely spot, but doubt crept in. Would they even have time to block the road? The man didn't seem convinced, and Mike found himself feeling like a student being tested by a strict teacher. Behind him, two large men stood, their expressions amused as they held their weapons at the ready. They were the muscle chosen for their strength rather than intelligence. Once, Mike had been brought in for the same reason, but now he was expected to think for himself. This was his chance to prove he belonged among the real criminals, the legendary names that had become infamous. He pulled out another map, this one marked with important locations, places where law enforcement would be stationed. With confidence, he outlined the plan. They would hit the bank, be in and out in 9 minutes, and escape through carefully planned turns, avoiding known police spots. He calculated their timing, assuring them that by the time law enforcement realized what had happened, they would already be past the state line. But the leader wasn't so easily convinced. What if something went wrong? Delays, mistakes, bad luck. So many things could disrupt the plan. What if a civilian got in the way? Mike's answer was simple. If anyone stood between them and the door, they wouldn't hesitate. The men behind him, the Finnegan brothers, nodded in agreement. There was no room for error. The old man paused, locking eyes with the young woman. "You see me as a harmless old man," he said. "But I wasn't always like this. I was like the others, smart, careful, but never afraid to do what had to be done. I hated violence, never wanted to hurt anyone. But if it came down to me or someone else, I wasn't the one going down." She smiled faintly, though she didn't want to believe what she was hearing. Accepting this would mean she cared for someone who had lived as a criminal, something her past never prepared her for. He continued, insisting he wasn't reckless like others. He was a bank robber, not some trigger-happy lunatic. Another man sitting nearby challenged him. "That doesn't answer the question. If something goes wrong, what do you do?" The old man hesitated, then refocused on the map. "South. We go to Sioux Falls." The other man frowned, pointing out that the city was full of police. But the old man had a plan, switching license plates before reaching the city, blending in with the crowd. If roadblocks stopped them from heading north, they could slip into another state unnoticed. The plan was solid, and his companion clapped him on the shoulder in approval. It was one of the best compliments he ever received. Recounting one of his past jobs, he described the precision of their work. His crew moved like clockwork, the Finnegan brothers entering through the front, while he parked at the back. Slipping inside, he took his position, guarding the hostages. Among them was a striking woman in white. He had never forgotten her, though he didn't know why. The safe was blown, the gold was loaded, 8 trips, just over 3 minutes. The only sound was the countdown. At 9 minutes, he tipped his hat to the woman and walked out. They followed the escape route perfectly. No police. 9 hours later, they were back in St. Paul. A flawless heist. He admitted that he learned from the best, planning every detail, thinking beyond guns, removing luck from the equation. That was the key to success. But eventually, his luck ran out. He recalled how he got caught. Not from a job he pulled off, but from a foolish mistake. While relaxing in a bar, he ran into an old acquaintance who owed him money. The man paid him with Liberty bonds and drinks flowed freely. He should have left, but he stayed. Minutes later, police stormed in. His so-called friend had been involved in a bank heist, and investigators had traced them to the city. The bonds in his pocket were enough to put him away. Shaking his head, he marveled at the irony. 33 perfect jobs, and he got taken down for one he had nothing to do with. The conversation delved into the events following the South Dakota heist. The group had split the money in the car, with one man taking the gold and bonds, planning to regroup later. He dropped off his companions before parting ways for good. It was the last time anyone saw him, and his fate was a sad one. The discussion then shifted to the whereabouts of the gold, but no one had clear answers. The man had always been secretive about such matters, never revealing any details about fences or potential buyers. The topic turned to an architect who had mingled with the wrong crowd, thinking himself tougher than he was. The missing man had mentioned him a few times, but there was no solid connection. However, one detail stood out. He had been involved with the architect's wife. That revelation hinted at deeper complications, making it even harder to track down what had happened to the gold. Afterward, the protagonist left the nursing home, offering a woman a ride, but she chose to stay and be useful. Before parting, he advised her not to dwell too much on someone who didn't deserve her grief. She believed closure would come once the killer was found, though the protagonist doubted she truly understood the danger. A nagging thought surfaced. Could she have acted out of jealousy and rage? But he dismissed it, knowing she was too kind for such a thing. Returning home, he found messages waiting. Some urged him to reveal the truth about the murder and its ties to the stolen gold. Others were from a frightened woman who had found a place to hide but remained on edge. When he called her, she feigned ignorance at the mention of the architect's name. Her response was too quick, too smooth, raising suspicion. He invited her over, suggesting they talk in person. As soon as she agreed, he reached out to another contact, a man who had been expecting his call. The protagonist, aware that the pieces were starting to connect, knew it was time to gather more information. Whatever was happening, the answers lay in the tangled web of secrets surrounding the stolen gold and the people willing to kill for it. The protagonist hung up the phone and crossed the living room, peering through the drapes at the street outside. The beige Toyota Corolla was still there, parked 4 houses down, just as it had been the day before. The driver wasn't visible, but the protagonist suspected it was the same young man from Ricky's. The sight of the car brought an unexpected smile, and an old song hummed through their mind. Soon after, a woman arrived, dressed in a silky blue shirt dress that barely held together with only a few buttons fastened. She rushed inside, hugging the protagonist as if they had just saved her life. Her voice trembled as she admitted her fear and confessed that she had lied before. She spoke of how difficult her life had been, how people often tried to take advantage of her, and how she sometimes had to lie to protect herself. But now she needed help. She trusted the protagonist, knowing they had integrity and courage. Guiding her to a chair, the protagonist asked what she had lied about. She hesitated, lowering her gaze, and the way her dress fell didn't go unnoticed. The protagonist quickly distanced themselves, staying focused. She then admitted she knew who had killed Josh, someone named Boston Whitlow. She revealed that they had been in a relationship before she was involved with someone else and that Boston had known about the gold. At one point, they were partners, but greed had driven them apart. Boston hadn't just wanted a share, he wanted it all. When the protagonist questioned why Boston had targeted Josh instead of her, she struggled to answer. Maybe Josh had discovered something valuable, and Boston killed him to take it. But the protagonist pointed out that she could have been in the same danger. She insisted she wasn't capable of killing anyone, unlike Boston, who was ruthless. Then came a revelation that shook her. Boston had already met the protagonist. Her expression tensed as she learned they had shared coffee just the day before. She tried to hide her distress, but it was clear she was shaken. Her voice wavered as she asked what Boston had said. When the protagonist revealed that Boston wanted to team up, she stiffened. Her voice edged with suspicion. "I thought we were partners," she said, her eyes filled with uncertainty. The woman moved around the table, coming close to the protagonist, placing her hands on his shoulders. Her voice was firm as she reminded him of her offer, an equal split. She mentioned that another man had made her the same proposal, but she had not agreed to anything yet. The protagonist warned her not to trust the other man, but she countered by saying he had warned her about him as well. Desperation filled her voice as she pleaded for help, offering him anything in return. Before he could react, she pulled him into a deep kiss, her arms wrapping around him as she pressed close. His hands rested at her waist, and for a brief moment, he almost gave in. However, fate intervened as the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the room, forcing him to pull away. He teased her about her negotiation skills before stepping away to answer the door. When he returned, he wasn't alone. The moment she saw the man standing beside him, her smile faded into confusion, then completely disappeared. The newcomer greeted her with a tone filled with unspoken emotions, his expression shifting between joy, anger, and amusement. She quickly stood, demanding to know why he was there. Instead of answering, he commented on her dress, recalling a time she had worn it for him. Her reaction was immediate. She hastily buttoned her dress, though the message behind the action remained unclear. The protagonist, sensing the tension, turned away to gather himself. She demanded an explanation from the protagonist, but he simply stated that it was time for an honest conversation. The other man clarified that his presence had nothing to do with her, but she refused to acknowledge him. The protagonist then brought up the real issue, accusations of murder. The woman's face hardened as she turned away from the man, her voice sharp with betrayal. Shifting the conversation, the protagonist asked if the man had spoken to the police. He confirmed, describing the experience as unpleasant. He admitted to surrendering his weapon for testing and claimed he had been reading at home when the crime took place, an alibi that seemed weak at best. The woman scoffed at his words. The protagonist then turned his questioning to her, asking where she had been during the crime. Her response was curt. She had been in bed. The other man immediately asked if she had been alone, pushing her patience to its limit. Without hesitation, she lunged, swinging her hand toward him in a quick, precise motion. He blocked it just in time, their faces now dangerously close. Their breaths came in sharp, uneven gasps, filled with lingering emotions. The protagonist watched the exchange unfold, amused at the tension between them. The man's voice was hoarse as he spoke, filled with past pain. He accused her of breaking his heart, but she fired back, saying he had done it first. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she turned to the protagonist, asking why he had brought this man into their confrontation. Taking control of the moment, the protagonist ordered them both to sit. They obeyed, sitting across from each other, trying to avoid eye contact but failing. He stood at the head of the table, directing the conversation to an important matter, the letters. Confusion crossed the woman's face as she questioned what letters he meant. The protagonist explained that the man believed another individual had found letters and had offered him half of the gold in exchange for them. She immediately perked up, seeing an opportunity. If the protagonist had the letters, they could secure the gold without needing the other man. However, the man dismissed her excitement, stating that the protagonist didn't have them. The protagonist countered, claiming he could get them, but his lie was transparent. The man didn't believe him, and judging by her uncertain expression, neither did she. The protagonist smoothly shifted the discussion, bringing up another name. His gaze fell on the woman as he hinted that it was her turn to speak. The woman insisted she knew nothing about the man in question, but her response was met with skepticism. A tense exchange followed, with another man stepping in to defend her, showing a readiness to act if necessary. The atmosphere grew heavier as the protagonist made it clear that he had brought them there to pressure them into cooperating. He revealed that while both of them had expressed interest in working with him, neither was willing to share their own information. Tired of playing games, he offered a deal. Whoever told him the truth first would be his partner, or they could all split the reward evenly. The other man, unimpressed, stated he wasn't afraid. The woman, however, cautiously questioned whether the protagonist had been responsible for someone's death, but he quickly denied it. He then hinted at a lurking danger, directing their attention to a man sitting in a nearby car. Their fear became evident as they rushed to the window, peeking through the curtains. The discussion shifted to whether this unknown figure was involved in the death they were discussing, leading to the accusation that the protagonist had put the woman in danger. Despite the mounting tension, neither of them answered his questions about the man's identity or allegiance. Disappointed, he decided to leave them to their own devices and headed to the kitchen, grabbing 2 beers before making his way outside. As he approached the mysterious man in the car, he made a casual attempt to disarm the situation by offering him a drink. The man accepted without hesitation, seemingly unfazed by the interaction. Their conversation revealed that the protagonist had been aware of his presence for days, even recognizing his movements. He then pointed out an interesting fact: depending on which side of the street they were on, calling the police would result in a different response time. He playfully hinted that an open beer bottle in public could be enough to get him arrested. The man found this amusing but remained tight-lipped about his employer, though it was clear he was no ordinary bystander. The conversation took a tense turn as the man made it clear he didn't like being called a kid. His words carried weight, but the other man remained unfazed, coolly suggesting he relay a message to his boss. The message was simple: he was open to business no matter the scale. However, he also made it clear that he didn't appreciate being watched or followed. If it happened again, he'd take matters into his own hands. The man listening smirked, suggesting he'd only be in trouble if he saw him coming. With that, he handed over his half-finished beer, started his car, and drove away, disappearing into the night. The protagonist stood there for a moment, reflecting on the encounter. His own thoughts mocked him, another person he failed to intimidate. When he stepped back inside, he found the woman still standing by the door. Surprised, he questioned her presence. She, in turn, asked what had just happened. Brushing off the tension, he casually mentioned sharing a beer. She followed him into the kitchen, watching as he discarded the remaining beer and prepared to open another. When he offered her a drink, she turned down the beer, asking for something lighter. After some playful back and forth about her taste in drinks, he eventually poured her a glass of Riesling, served in fine crystal. As she sipped, she complimented his choice of wine, assuming he had an expert palate. He corrected her: his girlfriend was the real connoisseur. The mention of the girlfriend made the conversation shift. He questioned why she was still there instead of leaving with the other man. She firmly corrected him: her relationship with the man was in the past. But while he might have moved on without fear, she admitted she wasn't as brave. She was scared, and she wasn't afraid to say it. Curious, the protagonist pressed her for answers. She hesitated, unsure if she could trust him. He flipped the question back: could he trust her? The silence stretched between them. Then, after another sip of wine, she made up her mind. She promised to tell him everything, warning that it was a long story. As he refilled her glass, she finally revealed a name: Timothy Dolan. He was a wealthy man who had made his fortune in the mortgage industry before cashing out at the right moment. Now retired, he lived in an exclusive area where only the truly rich could afford to settle. The protagonist recognized the place and remarked that someone like him wouldn't be welcome there. The woman, however, had a different dream. If she could find what she was looking for, Jelly's gold, she believed she could finally afford a life among the elite. But money wasn't the only issue. Somehow, Dolan knew their names, and that changed everything. The protagonist and their partner had once worked together, hired by a wealthy businessman to ghostwrite a book. The man, who preferred to be called Tim, wanted to publish a self-praising business book under his own name, a common practice among celebrities and businessmen. He paid well but required them to sign a strict confidentiality agreement, ensuring that no one would know the book was ghostwritten. During their research, the protagonist uncovered an unexpected truth about the man's past. He had always claimed to have been born on a French ocean liner in the middle of the Atlantic during a hurricane. His parents, both Americans, had supposedly wanted him to be born on American soil. However, the research revealed that he was actually born in a Paris hospital in February, not July as he had always believed. The man himself had not invented the story, his parents had. Curious about the reason behind this deception, the protagonist and their partner dug deeper. They discovered that his mother, originally named Catherine Messer, had been married to a well-known architect from St. Paul. She had supposedly gone on a solo European vacation but soon met another man, Jim Dolan, who was also from St. Paul. The protagonist's partner speculated that the two had known each other before and had arranged to meet in Paris, suggesting an affair. Shortly after, Catherine divorced her husband and married Jim Dolan, later announcing the birth of a child in July instead of February. This change was likely meant to make it appear that her new husband was the father rather than her previous one. When the protagonist revealed these findings to Tim, he refused to believe them, accusing them of being incompetent and dishonest. The truth was too much for him to accept. Instead of quitting, the protagonist and their partner decided to investigate further, focusing on Catherine's former husband. They discovered that he had been a respected architect with strong political connections. Digging deeper, they found a newspaper article linking him and his wife to a notorious criminal, an Oklahoma gunman named Frank Nash. The article suggested that they had celebrated together after a major bank robbery, which added an unexpected twist to their research. When the protagonist presented this information to Tim, he remained silent for a moment, then coldly reminded them of their confidentiality agreement and fired them. The truth they had uncovered did not align with the image he had built for himself. The conversation took a serious turn as the woman explained how she and her former partner had been investigating the hidden gold. They initially thought it might be a good story for a magazine, but as they dug deeper, they became convinced the gold had been hidden before its owner was killed. Since then, she had been searching for it, even after parting ways with her partner. When asked why they split, she admitted he had betrayed her, though she blamed herself. She considered herself high maintenance, but the man reassured her, making her laugh despite the painful memories. She had then teamed up with another man she knew from school, believing he was a skilled researcher. However, that partnership also ended in betrayal. She acknowledged her poor choices in partners, adding that, at least this time, the other woman involved was beautiful, making it slightly easier to accept. As she sipped her drink, the conversation shifted to a young man seen earlier, whom she suspected was working for a wealthy and powerful man. The protagonist asked why this man would care about the gold, considering his fortune. The woman speculated that it wasn't about money but rather about protecting a secret from his past. She admitted she had initially blamed her former partner for what happened, but now she believed the powerful man was behind it. When asked if he might go as far as killing, she nodded, convinced of his ruthlessness. She then pleaded with the protagonist to pass on a message, assuring the powerful man that they were not trying to expose him and had honored their agreement. As the conversation drew to a close, the woman playfully hinted at wanting more from the protagonist, but he firmly resisted, reminding her that he wouldn't betray his own relationship. She laughed, amused by his refusal, but then turned serious, admitting she truly liked him. Unlike the others she had met, he was a good man, something she rarely encountered. With a final, heartfelt compliment to the woman he was loyal to, she accepted the situation and left, leaving behind a lingering sense of admiration and regret. The protagonist watched from the window as the woman got into her car and drove away. She was clearly too intoxicated to drive, but resisting temptation wasn't always easy. Once she was gone, the protagonist picked up the phone and called a woman he knew. He greeted her with a teasing remark about being lucky, to which she responded with familiarity. He quickly updated her on his findings, and she mentioned meeting a man at a chamber luncheon. He had been charming and funny, hardly the type to be involved in anything violent. The protagonist countered that motivation could drive anyone to unexpected actions. Later, he found himself at the Vital Records office, searching for birth and death records of key individuals, but without exact dates. Obtaining them proved difficult. The clerk was unimpressed with his request, explaining that without proper documentation, retrieving old records would take over a week. When he suggested searching through the records himself, her reaction made it clear she didn't appreciate the idea. Instead, she advised him to visit the Minnesota Historical Society, where the information was digitized. Following her suggestion, he accessed the Minnesota Death Certificates Index online and retrieved the necessary details. The records showed that 2 of the individuals had lived long lives, but one had died much earlier. His curiosity led him to the Ronald M. Hubbs microfilm room, where historical newspapers were stored. He searched through old editions of the St. Paul Dispatch from 1936, hoping to find more details about the early death. What he discovered was shocking, a headline detailing an architect's sudden and violent death. The man had been killed in an explosion while trying to start his car. Even more intriguing, he had been identified as a key witness in a corruption probe. Authorities were investigating whether the explosion was an accident or something far more sinister.